my friend from Nebraska, Representative Jeff Fortenberry, to share your thoughts at this moment in history.
First, let me thank the gentlelady from Missouri for your leadership, not only tonight, but on this absolutely most critical issue. There is an important court case tomorrow, one that has come upon our country fairly quietly. I'm not sure most Americans actually know what is at issue here. But what is at issue is whether or not the relationship between the government and her people will fundamentally shift. Whether the government will be able to coerce people who disagree as to the content of what their health care should be, based upon their religious faith or their deeply held ethical sensibilities. And if they don't obey, they will be fined, as has mentioned here earlier. In a very ironic way, the case before the Supreme Court tomorrow is about whether or not Hobby Lobby, a store which millions of Americans, I assume, enjoy shopping at, I enjoy shopping at, who very outwardly celebrates, projects its Christian perspective in the way it conducts its business. And I assume because of that perspective, the desire to do the right thing by their employees, they have established a good health care plan. If they drop their health care plan, they'll be fined $2,000 by the government. That's all they'll have to pay. Yet, if they refuse to go along with that which violates their religious perspective and fundamental ethical sensibilities, the government will fine them $36,000. So again, the irony here is striking, that a business that is doing the right thing, that is based upon the values of their owners, who promote good products that millions of Americans enjoy, who close on Sunday because that's their stated Christian belief, and that's the way they choose to exercise it. I don't see any lawsuits over that. But nonetheless are saying in their health care plan they simply cannot provide certain drugs that would violate the dictate of their faith. Certain drugs that this administration has deemed preventative. Now, again, another irony here is when most of us were looking at the health care bill when it was first passed, there was a portion that was put in there called prevention services. Now, I did not vote for the health care bill. I believe we need the right type of health care in our country, one that actually reduces cost and improves health care outcomes and protects vulnerable people. But what we have instead is a huge shift of cost to unsustainable government spending and a serious erosion of health care liberties. We can do better than this. We must do better than this. But buried in that health care bill was prevention authority. Well, to me, that means that we're going to try to prevent the onset of diabetes or the onset of heart disease, chronic disease, which is part of what is driving up our health care costs, and that if we were all thinking about and adhering to the principles and dynamics of wellness, then we could maybe get underneath. That's what I thought it was about. And instead, it's an ideology of the administration that is imposing upon people of faith or other Americans who simply do not have a faith perspective on this, but are suggesting that no, religious freedom is a first freedom, and the government should not coerce people from their deeply held, reasonably held belief systems or those who have ethical sensibilities to certain types of drugs and procedures. That's what is at issue here. And if it goes the wrong way, the relationship between the government and her people will ultimately change. Because, you see, the government will then be conferring this right of religious liberty, not protecting it. It will be deciding who gets to exercise what type of religious liberty, rather than protecting the individual conscience of the person, that sacred space that is inherent to the dignity of all persons, and where does our rights actually come from? In the First Amendment of the Constitution, this is clearly stated, and it's reflected in the ideals of religious liberty and separation of church and state. I have a copy of the original Bill of Rights, not the original, but the copy of the original, in my office. And actually penciled in there, as they were working through the draft, it says the rights of conscience. See, that concept precedes, actually, the principle of religious freedom, because it says, again, rights are not conferred by the government. They come from the inherent dignity of each person by virtue of who they are and the way in which they've been created. And that person's ability to express who they are in the most poignant way, particularly in their religious faith, is a sacred space that the government must protect. That's why they listed it as number one, the number one spot in the Bill of Rights. That's what tomorrow is about. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, there was a young child born named Jean Gauguin, and she was one of 8 children, and they lived in the west coast of France, and her father was a fisherman. But one day he was lost at sea, and the family was reduced to poverty. And Jean Gauguin, as a teenager, she went out and worked as a maidservant, doing servile labor to help the family and to help sustain herself. She received a proposal of marriage, but in her own discernment decided that was not appropriate to her, and apparently lived a quiet and humble life. And one day she saw a woman outside in the cold who was blind and paralyzed and freezing. And she picked her up and brought her to her own bed. And this was a key turning point in Jean Gauguin's life. Perhaps she always knew her life would turn out this way. But there was a religious order called the Little Sisters of the Poor who traced their origins back to that simple act of kindness to Jean Gauguin. She was canonized as saint by Pope John Paul after a medical doctor from Omaha area, from Nebraska, received a miraculous cure after having asked for her intercession. And she was recently canonized a saint. The Little Sisters of the Poor are not nuns on a bus. They are not political activists. They just take care of the vulnerable elderly through healthcare facilities. And yet they find themselves having to sue the federal government to be able to exercise their religious freedom as they see fit. That's what this health care bill has brought about through this prevention mandate. It is a direct frontal assault on America's first freedom, so much so that a group of humble nuns, and as I spoke to one, she told me, we just see in the elderly Christ. That a group of humble nuns who have dedicated their lives to the poor and vulnerable in health care are now having to fight in our court system for their rights to exercise their religious faith as they see fit. So tomorrow's decision, while it is about 2 very strong businesses, Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Woods, has very vast ramifications. Even for people who are in religious orders, who have set up charitable institutions, who are being forced by the government to again buy products through their health care plans for their employees that are inconsistent with their faith tradition. As one of the nuns told me, she says, it violates our conscience, you know. We didn't want to sue the government, but yet here we are. So I'm glad to have had a little bit of opportunity with you tonight, my good friend Vicki Hartzler, to discuss this most essential of issues. Because if we don't speak, who is going to speak? Because I'm not quite sure that all of America has realized really what is at stake at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Whether the government will be allowed to coerce Americans into violating that fundamental first freedom of religious faith and the rights of conscience. If so, it will be tremendously unfair, it's un-American, and it will change the nature of, again, the relationship between government and our people. Let's hope that the Supreme Court gets this right. There's a few precedents before this where they have gotten it right. In fact, the Little Sisters of the Poor have gotten an injunction so that this is not being forced upon them at the moment. But the principle here that's at stake is whether or not the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right to religious freedom, an appropriate separation of between church and state, is going to hold and remain that most cherished freedom in our country to come. Thank you. I yield back.